I begin today by acknowledging the Jar Jar Wurrung, traditional custodians of the land on which we meet today, and pay my respects to the elders past and present. I extend respect to any Aboriginals and Torres Strait Islanders peoples who are here today. Thanks. Okie doke. Today we're going to get mired in stone. It's my pleasure to introduce Sue Walter, who's going to talk about her work she's been doing on the quarries and stone around Bendigo. I had the pleasure of reading Sue's thesis from Fed Uni a couple of years ago, which, thank goodness, she did a good job and she's now a doctor. Okay, thanks.
Thank you for the introduction, Charles, and welcome to our local and our remote listeners tonight. Thanks for your interest, and Bendigo Archives Centre hopes that through the Discovering History program we can encourage you to use Bendigo Archives for your own research or special project. So as Charles mentioned, studying the history of stone is my passion. Every day we move through landscapes that have been defined by and created with stone, but much of it is easily overlooked. Stone is an ancient material used for millennia by mankind to alter nature's landscapes for his own purpose, and the work involved in using it can be easily taken for granted and underestimated. Finding adequate resources of suitable quality is only the beginning. Bluestone is a well-known stone used historically in Victorian buildings. It is a form of basalt created by extrusive lava flows from our ancient volcanic landscapes. For a long time, basalt has also been a standard choice in Victoria for breaking down into gravel or aggregate due to its durability and prolific sources within the state. Not all local councils had easy access to basalt rocks, however, which forced them to try granite or sedimentary rocks or pay an often hefty price for transport. Even suitability and durability of basalt varied according to its source, and those best suited for buildings were not necessarily also suited for making durable or affordable road surfaces. Further complications can arise when issues around transport, handling, processing, law, architectural design, and even social attitude are brought into the mix. Tonight I will share 4 short historical accounts that relate to the quarrying and use of stone in Bendigo district. These were found in our archives and demonstrate some of the quirky stories which arose from mixing stone, politics and people. These are under the headings of the council experiment, parochial stone throwing, where we look at Axedale versus Malmesbury bluestone, holes in history, how do we actually find the history of quarries, and then I'm going to ask the question, what price road making? Full details and sources can be found on our website, and we currently have a display upstairs as well. In this talk, I will frequently use the term road metal, which was a term used for crushed rock used for gravel or aggregate. To set the scene, I'll give you an extremely brief history of road making. While road design and drainage are key factors that determine how well a road functions, the materials used to construct them are essential in determining the ability of a road to withstand traffic. In the days before bitumen roads, the metal rims of the wheels of horse-drawn vehicles put significant pressure on road metal, and in the wrong conditions would grind it down, creating a dust problem in summer and mud in winter. Finding sources of good hard road metal was essential if councils were to minimise their expenditure on roads. And in this respect, the borough of Sandhurst, later the Bendigo City Council, was no different. Road making is an ancient art, as the remains of paved Roman roads in parts of Europe attest. But roads of this nature were expensive and labour intensive, and beyond the reach of rural councils in colonial Victoria. The basic principle is to have the centre of the road higher than the verges, i.e. make it convex in shape, also known as the camber of the road. Then you place large stones as a foundation, such as pitching or cobbling roads, and smaller broken stones as an upper layer which could be replaced as it wore down. The turnpike or toll road system was introduced in England from the 1650s, which charged a levy on those wishing to use vehicles on public roads. This triggered a slow evolution towards effective road management, including the design of roads and the materials used in their construction. The methods developed and introduced by Scottish pioneers of good road construction John McAdam and Thomas Telford made a vast difference to the structure and repair of roads. McAdam is probably more renowned in Australia than Telford through the term macadamised roads, in reference to the thorough drainage, the carefully prepared material, the bed being formed of broken stone that would compact into a hard, durable layer. The Victorian colonial government introduced a system of toll roads on specifically proclaimed main roads, such as the Mount Alexander Road from Melbourne. Typically, the local councils erected and managed the toll booths, and the colonial government determined which roads the collected funds would be spent on. The funding for the other local roads was raised by charging rates on the occupants of land within council boundaries. The origins of many Victorian councils lie in the formation of road boards, created to construct and maintain local roads. This does not, of course, mean that those elected to represent the ratepayers on a council had any real practical skills, knowledge or understanding of road making and repairs in local circumstances, or employed people with those skills. As we shall see, the City of Bendigo certainly faced its own set of challenges. So let's begin. In February 1866, Bendigo had a dust problem. At that month's meeting, the Mayor of Sandhurst Borough Council moved that tenders be called for the supply of 4,000 yards of road metal to be broken from stone similar in quality to that which was then lying at the Town Hall. The metal was proposed to be laid onto the streets not more than a mile in any direction from Pall Mall. The town surveyor said that this would cost a minimum of £1,500 and that 4,000 yards alone would be needed to metal Pall Mall from Knight's Corner to the Black Swan Hotel and in View Place and View Bend. The Mayor's aim was to experiment to see if laying the metal would help to resolve the dust problem, and the council voted in favour of the experiment to use stone instead of the mixture of 1/3 pebbles and 2/3 clay and slate, typically used on the roads in what was referred to as its cheap and dirty system of dust and mud making. In March, the council accepted the tender of Mr Hughes, and within a week, men were observed breaking the stone described as hard in texture from Wattle Square, which is on the corner of Wattle and High Street. And you can see from the slide there, that was the public park. It was actually gazetted as a public square under the control of the council in 1861. So clearly the council were experimenting with stone taken from a designated public park. The surface geology of the district shows that the Wattle Square stone would not have been volcanic in nature, such as basalt or granite, instead it was sedimentary. While stone breaking machines were available in the 1860s, in this case the men were breaking up stone using spool hammers and a lot of physical effort. Laying the stone on the road itself commenced in April 1866 at Viewpoint, and it was hoped the contractor would be able to complete the whole of Pall Mall and Viewpoint before winter to permit the new surface to set before the wet weather began. The town surveyor George Fletcher was concerned that a shortage of water would prevent the new stone from binding, and Councillor Edward O'Keefe recommended sections of road not yet metal to be picked to try and encourage better binding. The surveyor was also instructed to procure a few yards of the best metal from the basalt rock which would be got either from Harcourt or Malmesbury for the purpose of testing its durability as compared with the metal now being laid down in Pall Mall. The experiment would, he believed, satisfy the public on the subject, as there appeared to be a question of the durability of the present metal. In May 1866, the Mayor wanted to conduct another experiment. He wanted 100 yards of basalt metal to be purchased and spread on Pall Mall, perhaps in a high-impact area near the Shamrock Hotel. The surveyor believed that while the metal from Harcourt or Malmesbury would not be one bit better than the Wattle Square metal, he thought the experiment advisable and would hopefully satisfy the public. Councillor O'Keefe, however, was unconvinced of the need for the experiment, having tested the durability of the Malmesbury and Harcourt metal with a machine in the council's yard at Macrae Street. The basalt had been ground to a powder, while the Wattle Square metal was almost unbroken. O'Keefe convinced his fellow councillors to witness the testing of the stone in the municipal yard before they voted on the motion. The results of the test on Malmesbury bluestone were convincing enough for the motion to be withdrawn, although there was no report on the suitability of the Harcourt granite. Whether Edward O'Keefe actually had any formal training in road making is not known, but he clearly had experience in road construction. He had previously worked in mining operations in Blackwood and Bendigo. In 1857, he had established himself as a local road contractor, initially working on the Mount Coron Road, before becoming a councillor of the Sandhurst in 1860. But whatever the road making methods were in Bendigo in 1866, there were clearly problems that needed to be solved. O'Keefe was, however, correct in his assessment of Malmesbury bluestone for road making purposes. Not all basalts are hard and break into angular pieces when crushed, and although by 1866 Malmesbury bluestone had a strong reputation as a building stone, which could be easily worked and carved, it was these very properties which did not make it resistant to road traffic. I'm actually now going to pass around a basket of samples, like 4 samples of stone in there. You can pick up and show and tell time. So in those 4 samples, there's a sample of a core sample of Malmesbury bluestone. There's some Harcourt granite, a piece of bluestone from Axdale, and for comparison, a piece of bluestone from Dunstown near Ballarat that's currently used for road making as well. Visitors at home will see those same samples on the slide there, or 3 of them anyway. The Bendigo Advertiser, usually quite critical of the state of the town's roads, determined that by using the wattle square stone, Bendigo Council had mended their ways and had spared the residents the usual plague of dust created by the typical use of mine tailings and sludge. But they could not understand why, under O'Keefe's direction, this metal was then covered with mine tailings and buried out of sight. It was suggested that O'Keefe should not thrust the tailings upon the streets to be an everlasting nuisance. Councillor Moore's effort to have the same wattle square stone spread on the main road through Long Gully was unsuccessful. He believed the dust was caused by the rubbish laid on the streets under the old system of what was facetiously termed road making. The Bendigo Advertiser suggested that the Mayor, with Councillor O'Keefe, should be condemned to reside in Long Gully in summer, upon which they would be cured of their absurd predilection for the cheap and nasty system of making the roads. A traveller, the newspaper argued, whose disagreeable business it is to pass through the dust lane between the shops of Long Gully, must shut his mouth and compress his nostrils and hold his breath until he has passed through the clouds of pulverised dirt that form a large portion of the atmosphere which the constituents of Councillor Moore inhale. By October 1868, the big road-making experiment on Pall Mall was deemed a failure by the Bendigo Advertiser, which stated that binding of the road surface only created more dust to bind the eyes of the unfortunate public of Sandhurst. As a postscript to this story, I found it somewhat ironic that after the death of Councillor Edward O'Keefe in 1876, his grave in the Whitehill Cemetery is primarily erected with Malmesbury bluestone. The council's idea that stone from Malmesbury or Harcourt could be used on Bendigo's roads ignored the simple logic that transporting and handling such material was expensive. The quarries at Malmesbury and Harcourt were not close to railway lines, and while it was cost effective to transport large blocks of stone for building purposes, the same could not be said for road metal. Whether large blocks of waste stone were brought to Bendigo and then broken up by hand and spread in situ, or stone broken at the quarries was loaded onto carts and then transported to a railway station, shipped to Bendigo, then offloaded slowly and spread, neither would have been time or cost effective. Now we'll hear more about the role that Axdale bluestone played in the development of Bendigo, but perhaps not in the way we might all imagine. Axdale has long been known for its bluestone quarries. Located on the basalt plains of the Campaspe River Valley east of Bendigo, they are some of the closest sources of bluestone for the Bendigo city. The Bald Hill or Woodstock volcanic flows near Morong are a similar distance away from Bendigo, and stone was occasionally carted from there to Bendigo by rail, including the rock used here, as you can see in the Rosalind Park Fernery in 1882 and 1886. Despite being some 14 miles or 22 kilometres away by road, the Axdale quarries were described by the Bendigo Advertiser in 1873 as being such a short distance from the city, this being before the Heathcote Railway was constructed. Bluestone has been quarried at Axdale since at least 1861, when their Catholic church was built from local bluestone. In 1873, these quarries were described as an extensive source of the most magnificent bluestone in the colony, of almost inexhaustible supply, sufficient to build a pyramid or a city of the most palatial structure. The Bendigo Advertiser's readers might have agreed with the newspaper's hypes, despite similar claims being made about Lethbridge and Malmsey bluestone. However, Bendigo today is not generally known for its bluestone buildings, and the predicted palatial city of bluestone did not eventuate. In 1874, Malmsey bluestone was also said to have an inexhaustible supply, but the best building stone from these quarries had been consumed by the late 1920s. Its reputation as an excellent building stone is demonstrated by its use from 1856 in buildings and structures around Victoria, New South Wales, South Australia, Tasmania, Western Australia and New Zealand. Similarly, the Lethbridge bluestone quarries were described in 1874 as almost inexhaustible, yet these quarries were also quiet by the 1930s. Lethbridge stone was also sold and used in Melbourne, Newcastle and Sydney and Adelaide. And apart from a suggestion in 1913 it would be used in New Zealand, it does not appear to have spread much further than this. Part of the reason the Malmsey bluestone was so widely used was the introduction to Victoria in 1867 of machinery that could saw bluestone. Being a highly workable stone and relatively close to Melbourne, Malmsey became the favoured source of stone used to create products like paving, gravestones, steps and windowsills. Similar stone sawing machinery was soon operating in Malmsey itself and in Bendigo at Messrs. Finn and Quinn at Downing Street, both in 1874. It was the pitching or cobbling and paving of the city's cattle yards and some of the streets, and the introduction of the stone sawing plant at Bendigo, that triggered one round of what I have called parochial stone throwing in 1874. Mr. Ward refused to sign a contract with the City Council in March 1873 because he wanted to supply bluestone pitchers from Malmsbury and not from Axdale, at a cost of 8 shillings and 11 pence per yard. The Axdale stone supposedly being better and thus more costly. Whether Ward's supply was coming directly from Malmsbury was not recorded, but if produced mechanically, at that time they would have been coming from the Footscray. Rather than accept Ward's conditions, the council called for new tenders, which resulted in Ingham & Co being granted a contract for the same work at the higher price of 10 shillings per yard. At about the same time, the new savings banks in Hargrave Street neared completion. It was reported that the foundation walls were composed of Harcourt granite, and the front steps and entrance porch paved with Malmsey bluestone. No public criticism of these vital materials appears to have been made in the newspapers. However, the same cannot be said for the council's decision to use some of the same Malmsey bluestone paving in Williamson Street in early 1874. In February 1874, the City Council sought the Malmsey Stone Sawmill's price for flags, or paving stones, for Williamson Street. And at the next meeting, the council approved the calling of tenders for the work. In March, after they received tenders from the Footscray Stone Sawing Company, Mr. Ingham at Axdale, Finn & Co in Bendigo and the Malmsbury Stone Sawing Company, they awarded the contract to the Malmsbury Company for 13 shillings and 6 pence per yard, having put the names of Finn and the Malmsbury Company in a hat to decide between the two identical tenders. On the same day, they also voted to accept a further tender from Nat Farley Ingham at Axdale for more pitched crossings, this time at the higher price of 13 shillings per yard. Awarding the contract to the Malmsbury Company was quite unacceptable to Ratepayer, who wrote to the Bendigo Advertiser, believing that the council should have shown preference to the local company, insisting that the councillors were obliged to look after the best interests of the district and to promote its welfare and prosperity in every fair and legitimate manner. And when deciding upon tenders, should not only consider the price, but also look at the collateral advantages or disadvantages which could arise from the acceptance of any particular tender. Ratepayer asserted that all the money paid by the council would be spent locally if Finn and Quinn and Co were given the job, whereas only the portion paid to install the stone would be spent locally by them contracting the Malmsbury Company. This ignores the fact that Finn, Quinn and Co were intending to purchase a stone in the rough of Malmsbury, hence some of their own income would be spent outside the district. He also argued that being ratepayers, Finn, Quinn & Co. had more rights to be considered for the work than the Malmesbury Company, since the latter would not have contributed to the maintenance of local roads. Ratepayer did not consider that if the stone was sent from Malmesbury in the rough, i.e. an uncut block, and then sawn in Bendigo, freight charges would apply to the portion of the block that would become wastage after arrival in Bendigo. If this was the case, the Bendigonians set to benefit from paved footpaths would only pay a minor contribution to the roads in Malmesbury that were being constantly damaged by carting stone from their quarries for the benefit of other towns. The extra income earned by the Malmesbury Company for supplying sawn stone could have contributed rates for their local roads. Ratepayer also did not seem to consider that someone in Bendigo who received an income from the works in Williamson Street might dare to purchase something from Melbourne instead of Bendigo with that money. It is interesting that ratepayer was more perturbed by the location in which the stone would be processed as opposed to the source of the stone itself, perhaps in recognition that there were fewer alternatives. As a lone voice in this protest, he may simply have been a disgruntled, unsuccessful tenderer, and the majority of residents who trod the otherwise rough, unbinding gravel footpaths of Bendigo did not care where the improved pavements came from. It might not be a coincidence that the letter sent in protest to the council by Finn, Quinn & Co. on the same issue bears similarities in content to the letter sent by Ratepayer to the Bendigo Advertiser. The remnant original sawn bluestone paving still visible in several places in Victoria, such as in Kyneton, Malmesbury and Melbourne, is a testament to the enduring qualities of bluestone for footpaths. And while asphalt and concrete pavements eventually became the norm, bluestone paving is once more in vogue in parts of Victoria. It is rare to find surviving original bluestone paving in Bendigo. That surrounding the former post office in Pall Mall, which we can see on the slide there, is an uncommon example. You notice how big the slabs are there compared to current bluestone paving. By 1875, Malmesbury bluestone was also used in the construction of a new fountain for Mr. Lazarus at his West End Hall property, the new gasworks in Williamson Street, and on Mrs. John Reed's grave at the Bendigo Cemetery. Ratepayer, however, appears to have been silent on these uses of Malmesbury bluestone in Bendigo, possibly because Finn and Quinn were suppliers for at least two of his works. When a railway to Murchison via Heathcote was proposed in 1880, advocates argued that it should run through Axter. This would permit Mr. Ingham to compete with the Melbourne trade for the supply of bluestone and building, for channeling and other purposes to all parts of the colony, and in bluestone alone there could be immense traffic on the line. Bluestone for curbing and channeling in Bendigo was already being sourced from the inexhaustible Axdale quarries, and an estimated 5,000 cubic yards of road metal could also be supplied were it not for the freight costs. Tenders for this line were received in January 1887, and the successful tenderer for the Heathcote to Bendigo section was Andrew O'Keefe, son of Edward mentioned previously. Work commenced in February 1887 and the line opened in 1888, including the station at Axdale. Thus, prior to this, any Axdale stone used in Bendigo would have been freighted by road. During this period, Malmesbury bluestone had also been used in the Bendigo Town Hall improvements, the White Hill Cemetery gates, Reverend Backhouse's grave, Convent of Mercy High School, Quarry Hill State School, and All Saints Church fence. All installed with barely a hint of local discontent from local ratepayers being expressed by the Bendigo newspapers. This was not the case, however, when work commenced in 1882 on the new public buildings, in other words, the post office in Pall Mall, built by the Victorian government. Being a major source of funds for the project, the Victorian government had significant control over the construction of this building. Tenders were called for the foundations in March 1882, with the contract being awarded to Richard Grant of Kyneton. Works commenced in June, and while the foundations themselves were expected to take a year to complete, the whole structure was estimated to take 4 to 5 years. The foundations were still incomplete in September 1883, partly due to the supply of stone. During this phase of construction, the public began to raise questions of what type of stone would be used in the upper portions of the building, with suggestions that stone from the Stawell or Grampians quarries should be considered. By January 1884, it was anticipated that brick and stucco would be used for the superstructure above the granite and bluestone foundations, which had cost about £13,000. Tenders for the superstructure were called in March 1884 and a contract issued for £25,000. The memorial stone for the building was unveiled by the Victorian Governor in August 1884, it being a piece of Harcourt granite from Blight's quarry and worked by local monumental mason Peter Finn. And you can see that at the top example of the slide there. It was originally intended that the foundation stone would be of bluestone, but the council were informed by the contractor in late July 1884 that he could not source a piece large enough, so a piece of polished granite was used instead. Napthali Ingham was, however, perturbed that Axdale bluestone was not used for the foundation stone, believing he could have supplied a suitable block of stone, and the public money which the Sandhurst ratepayers contributed as taxes should be circulated among their own people and working men, instead of spending money in Harcourt or even Lethbridge. Like ratepayer in 1874, Ingham had also not considered that the Victorian government's contribution to the project was coming from revenue raised Victoria-wide. Perhaps conveniently, Ingham also did not mention that both Axdale and Harcourt, which is approximately 23 kilometres away and on an existing railway, were both outside the Sandhurst council boundaries. So in either circumstance, any colonial revenue raised in Sandhurst would have been expended in another shire. This then appears to have triggered a wider examination of all the stone used in the building, with questions being asked in the Victorian Legislative Assembly over the choice of Lethbridge, 165 miles away, and Malmesbury bluestone in the building. After stating that Lethbridge stone was finer and of closer grain and with less faults in the facing and dress, the Geelong Advertiser joined stone throwing by suggesting that if Sandhurst prefers a possibly inferior article to oblige somebody in the district, why not humour the caprice, especially if it will save money to the state? The Minister for Public Works assured the Assembly that only 850 feet of Lethbridge stone was to be used for the steps and paved areas, compared to the 3,000 feet of Malmesbury stone used on the exposed parts of the building. The justification for continuing to use the latter stone in preference to Axdale stone was to ensure there was a colour match between the stone in the foundations and the superstructure. Ingham does not appear to have commented on the use of Harcourt granite in the columns for the building, nor on Bendigo Advertiser's report on Finn & Co. of Bendigo being contracted to create polished Harcourt granite columns for a squatters' residence in Tasmania, or a bank in Melbourne in October 1884. The last two were private works, but not involving his own product, i.e. bluestone, ratepayers' money, or a product he could supply, i.e. columns, especially with the Heathcote Railway still under construction. The building was officially opened in September 1887 by the Commissioner of Public Works. The completion of the public offices now meant that the much-needed new law courts could be constructed on the adjoining site. This triggered a new round of parochial stone throwing. Tenders for the foundation of the new courts were called in May 1890, and with a contract issued in June, work commenced in July. The foundation stone was laid by the government in October. At the height of a recession, a lack of public funds delayed the construction of the superstructure. However, tenders for this were finally called in 1892, with a contract being awarded in June. Before the contract was awarded, a question was raised in the Victorian Parliament in late May if the Lethbridge stone specified in the tender could be altered to permit Axdale bluestone. It was also noted that slate from Mintaro in South Australia was specified to be used in preference to local Castlemaine slate. The specifications for the law courts also suggested or requested the use of Malmesbury bluestone. The Borough of Malmesbury, concerned about unemployment of their local quarrymen, wrote to the council, their local member of the Legislative Assembly in May 1892, asking for intervention in the matter regarding use of their stone in the building. A reply from the Public Works Department informed the Malmesbury Council that the tender specifications did not regulate the contractor to obtain stone from any specific quarries, but any stone used had to be equal to Malmesbury stone. By June, the Commissioner of Public Works had agreed to remove the restrictive clause from the specifications regarding Mintaro slate. Upon hearing this news, a deputation from the Mintaro Slate Company visited the Commissioner, stating that the slate was introduced to Victoria in an undressed state and the work to dress it was undertaken in Victoria. The Commissioner replied that while he had not promised to exclude Mintaro slate from the works in Victoria, he wished to give local slate a fair play where it was good enough. Whether any of the materials from Malmesbury, Axedale, Lethbridge, Castlemaine or Mintaro were good enough to be used in the court is hard to determine. When the building was officially opened in February 1896, no description of the building, in terms of any stone used in the superstructure, was reported, other than the use of stool stone in the staircase leading to the Supreme Court, the use of which did not elicit any public debate through the Bendigo Advertiser. In this instance, stone from Axedale, Castlemaine, Malmesbury and Lethbridge had all been excluded from the public dialogue. The stone used to record the opening of the building is the same material used in the decorative frieze on the top of the base course. And you can see on the slide there the decorative frieze, the middle ones from the courts and the lower ones from the post office, which is most likely Malmesbury bluestone because it's got carved work in it. The parochial attitudes to the use of stone in Bendigo from non-local sources was mostly targeted at public projects. When the new Catholic cathedral was being erected in 1897, the Bendigo Independent reported the use of Harcourt granite, Axedale bluestone and sandstone from Barrable near Geelong. While mention was made of the probable freight costs resulting from transporting these materials to Bendigo, no criticism was made of the church or the architects for selecting these materials in the first place. A month later, the same newspaper was explaining to the public how this edifice was contributing to the local economy through the use of bluestone from the Axedale quarries, supplied by Messrs. Beaver Main, despite most of the stone coming from elsewhere. The Bendigo money spent on stone in Harcourt and Geelong had conveniently been ignored, although it is perhaps no coincidence that Beaver Main regularly advertised their supply of Axedale bluestone in both Bendigo newspapers in 1897 through to at least 1901. To identify further hypocritical parochialism with respect to stone use in Bendigo, one also only has to look at local cemeteries to see how local money was spent on the importation of marble from Italy and granites from Scotland to erect memorials to the dear departed. This leaves one burning question. Is any gravestone erected to ratepayer constructed only of Axedale bluestone? Peter Hoey Finn's grave in Bendigo Cemetery, for example, is principally of white marble and grey granite. So now let's look at what I call holes in history. How do we actually find the history of these quarries? If you know that the quarries exist, Google Earth is a great place to start looking because they leave distinct scars on the landscape. And road signs such as Axedale Quarry Road are obvious clues. Documenting the history of these industrial sites through standard archival records such as rate books, probates and other land-related records can, however, be a challenge, especially if they were on private land. The image on the slide here, for example, is Napthali Ingham's probate, which makes no mention of any land being used for quarrying. It took me 6 years to research and write on the history of Malmesbury quarries, so I know that newspapers can become vital in piecing together their history. These are some of the Axedale quarries and quarry operators I've been able to uncover so far. The city's quarries I'll explain in more detail later as part of another story. So in terms of Ingham and Dean, we heard earlier that Napthali Ingham was working with local bluestone and probably operating a quarry at Axedale from the early 1870s. In 1885, his quarry was described as being on the left-hand side of the road to Heathcote, beyond the Campaspe River, on or adjoining Section B, Parish of Axedale. Ingham appears to have enjoyed a monopoly on Axedale bluestone until the mid-1890s. By 1904, there were signs that Ingham's quarrying activities were diminishing, and in 1906 he offered to sell 30 acres of quarry land at Axedale to the city of Bendigo. When Ingham died in 1909, he left his estate to his widow, Mary Ann. However, his probate makes no mention of owning or even leasing any land with a quarry upon it, despite there being extensive land holdings in the parishes of Axedale and Weston. There is mention of quarry tools, cranes and worked stone, but no indication that the valuations of the land considered any income from quarrying. Even the rate books do not record the presence of any quarrying on any of his land in or adjoining Axedale. When Mary Ann died in 1920, the local land she owned was the same, but again no mention is made in her probate of any quarrying activity upon it. Mary Ann left her real estate to her married daughter, Alice Dean, wife of Victor Dean of Axedale. By 1921, Victor Dean was running Waverley Quarries at Axedale, Waverley being the original Ingham homestead north of the Mackay Highway. The 1930 geological map, which is on the slide there, shows Dean's quarry as adjoining Ingham's site, so it's unclear whether Ingham or Dean opened this quarry, but neither of them appear as occupying or owning this land in the Mackay Shire rate books. Dean did not remain in the quarrying and stone crushing business for much longer. In 1936, he was fined for having in his possession an engine belt which belonged to Henry Trench, and you can look on the plan there, you can see Trench's quarry is just over the fence. In September 1937, Axedale Bluestone Quarries was registered as a company to take over the business of Victor Dean, who was in debt. This company offered all of the company's plant, buildings and machinery for sale in October 1938, primarily located on leased quarry land. The fact that the advertisement states executors desiring to realise suggests that Alice Dean was selling some of the land she inherited from her mother. When she died in 1948, Alice only owned the Waverley farm property, which appears to confirm the 1938 realising of her and Victor's assets. Contractors and wood merchants Stephen Riley, George Brazier and Albert Bolt were producing bluestone road metal, pitches and curbing for the district road by 1894. In 1896, they asked if the City Council would pay for an allotment of land at the Bendigo railway station upon which they could store bluestone and supply the council's contractors with materials. By 1900, they were operating a stone crushing machine at the railway yard at Axedale. Following the accidental death of Bolt in 1901, Frederick Nelson joined Riley and Brazier in their firewood and bluestone enterprise. In 1900 and 1901, the City Council decided to undertake improvement works on the Back and Bendigo Creeks, which included paving the Bendigo Creek from Charing Cross to Harney's Bridge with bluestone pitches. Work was well underway on Bendigo Creek by May 1901. However, by July, Brazier and Co were experiencing high demand for Axedale bluestone from road metal and pitches, and this included the materials needed for paving the creeks. There was supposedly a shortage of quarrymen, despite the pay rate, and a shortage of railway trucks during grain harvesting season, although the latter was denied by the Victorian Railways. Brazier and Co continued to win contracts to supply Bendigo Council with bluestone road metal, and in 1902 they offered screenings as a binding material delivered on the roads at 7 shillings per cubic yard, cheaper than the usual 8 shillings 6pence for broken metal. They offered to drop their prices further in 1906 if the council would extend their contract by 5 years. While Brazier and Co continued to supply the city of Bendigo with Axedale metal, curbs and pitches throughout the 1910s, in August 1920 they advertised that their partnership was dissolving and their whole quarrying and stone breaking operations were up for sale. The items on offer included the right to the Axedale railway siding and the lease of the quarries. Coincidentally, the auction date was the same date that Mary Ann Ingham died. With respect to Brazier's quarry, the Strathfield Say rate books show that in the 1920-22 rate year, a house in Axedale Township, formerly occupied by quarryman Riley and Co, became occupied by Joseph Senior, the owner being Trench and Co, Proprietary Limited. This is possibly the quarryman referred to as Joe Senior, who, when giving evidence at a Licences Reduction Board hearing in July 1916, stated that he was a subcontractor for the company controlling the quarries. Similarly, a Joe Senior advertised for quarrymen for the Axedale quarries in 1911 and 1912. The name Trench & Co as owners and or occupiers of the same house in Axedale continues to be recorded in the Strathfield Say rate books between 1923 and 27, after which it is simply recorded as Henry Laporte Trench until 1942. Trench's actual quarry was recorded on that same Knowsley geological plan we saw before, surveyed in 1930, which is adjoining Dean's Quarry at Ingham Siding. And there was a hint of one other quarry operator in Axedale in 1910, and that was Mr. G.H. Reid. But further details are sparse, other than advertisements seeking quarry workers and offering 1,000 cubic yards of spools to the Morong Shire Council in June. The fact that Brazier & Co was still in business and supplying road metal in 1910 and 12 suggests Reid was operating at another site, possibly Ingham's Quarry. By the early 1900s, some Victorian districts and councils were facing noticeable problems with accessing road making materials. This included finding suitable resources or the capacity to purchase and transport them within their financial constraints. Some of the solutions included the removal and crushing of dry stone walls for road metal, operating their own stone crushing machinery, and the purchase of quarry sites, all mainly designed to cut out the middlemen. Morong Shire, for example, purchased quarry sites in 1924 and 1925. For the city of Bendigo, the road metal problems faced in the 1860s once more came to the fore in the early 20th century. In 1906, the city surveyor reported that to make the best roads, the best materials used at an appropriate depth were needed. However, the Axedale stone was too expensive to achieve this. At this time, they were also using what was called reef stone, or a type of local sandstone. Councillor Hartness suggested that the council purchase and operate its own portable stone crushing machine and either purchase or lease a quarry. After much discussion, the council agreed to advertise for any offers to sell or lease a quarry near Bendigo. Tenders were received from Ali Ingham to sell 30 acres of quarry land at Axedale, and from Thomas Burke to lease 30 or 40 acres of quarry land within a mile of Axedale railway station. In March, the town clerk, the city surveyor and several of the councillors ventured out to view Axedale quarries and potential quarry land, and during their visit they saw Brazier & Co.'s stone crushers at work. The consensus was that the council would consider borrowing a stone crusher for a trial period, but they did not think any of the quarry sites were worthy of investing public money. Both Brazier & Co.'s sale and Mary Ann Ingham's death in 1920 appear to have influenced the local bluestone road metal market. The Argus reported in September 1920 that at Bendigo, the cost of road metal spools, which could be obtained in 1914 at 11.5 pence a cubic yard, had increased to 15 shillings a cubic yard. Because supplies from the mines were difficult to obtain, the council would have to resort to the Axedale quarries for spools. We already know that Victor Dean was running the Waverley quarries in Axedale by 1921, so the prices and level of demand may have triggered his involvement in the industry. By 1924, the output from the Axedale quarries had greatly increased, with 2,500 tonnes of stone leaving the Ingham siding in July of that year, some of which was probably destined for northern Victoria. What was not so well documented is what influence this had on the supply of bluestone materials to the city of Bendigo. If the increased production was mainly supplying other places in the district and beyond, this may have been a major influence in the decision of the City Council to finally purchase its own quarry. The city purchased a quarry at Axedale in May 1925 from Thomas O'Neill. The Shire of Strathfield, say, only records the city's new asset in the 1924-25 rate book, because a portion of it was leased to Owen Flynn for grazing, and Flynn was charged rates. The City Council's quarry is located on the northern fringes of the Axedale Township on allotments 11, 12 and 13 of Section 6, adjoining Raglan Street and east of Sugarloaf Road, which we can see on the slide there, outlined and actually clearly marked for the City's Council's quarry. This is probably the same site that Brazier & Co. were quarrying prior to 1920. It took a while for the City Council to lay out the quarry, establish the plant acquired, negotiate a lease with the Railway Department for a part of the Axedale Railway Station siding on which they established their plant, and obtain a special rate for rail freight from Axedale. This cost at least £5,600, and the city's mayor publicly declared There was enough stone in them to last for 1,000 years. The whole setup appears to have been completed by September 1928. Flynn paid rates for the lands surrounding the quarry he leased, but the city of Bendigo refused to pay rates to the Strathfield Shire for its quarry. This meant they were not contributing to the roads they were degrading by their own quarrying activities. In contrast, quarries at Malmesbury would charge rates from 1882. Strathfield say rate books no longer record the city of Bendigo as a landowner or occupier after the 1930-31 rate year, which coincides with the city selling in August 1929 about 95 acres of their quarry land to Duncan Cochrane, who owns some of the adjoining land. In fact, the line is left blank in the rate books each year to allow for the city's unrated land. Whether or not paying rates gave the city a competitive edge is debatable, given that the Mackayver and Strathfield say shires do not appear to have charged any other quarry operators any extra rates for quarrying activities on otherwise rural land. If they did, it is not recorded in the rate books. A freight discount obtained from the railway department may well have enabled the city to produce their own metal at a discounted rate, but that was the whole purpose of purchasing and operating a quarry in the first place. And for the final story, I've posed the question, what price road making? How far would we ask our councils to go to provide us with reliable local roads in an era of poor supply and high costs, should they break the law? Hidden deep in the city's archives is a story of how they illegally became a supplier of road metal to other councils and used bluff and political clout to try and make the problem go away. Let me explain. Victor Dean's financial prosperity and his relationship with the city of Bendigo began to waver from 1926. In that year, he won a tender to supply them with metal and screenings from inner siding. However, the council believed his price included delivery to Bendigo railway station. The finance committee, delegated to deal with the discrepancy, voted to cancel Dean's contract and seek new tenders. In October 1933, Dean wrote to the city of Bendigo demanding an explanation as to why they had seriously interfered with his business as a supplier of blue metal, screenings, toppings, pitchers and spools. Dean asserted that by entering into contracts to supply various shire councils, Country Roads Board, private contractors and others with such materials, either within or external to the city boundaries, they were operating in contravention of the Local Government Act. He requested them to desist or even take legal action to restrain them from such contracts. Dean's letter was not formally received at a council meeting, so by not recording it in the council minutes, it was kept out of the public domain. Instead, the council sought and received legal advice from Councillor W.H. Taylor, who was also a barrister and solicitor. Taylor's advice was that the City Council were in fact to breach the Local Government Act. The purpose of acquiring the Axdale Quarry, he said, was to provide themselves with materials for council work, and no other purpose was lawful. He stated that Dean's complaint was well-founded and completely justified, as the council did not possess any power under the statute to enter into such contracts for the sale and supply of metal, and such sale was not an essential part of the duties of the council under any statute. Any contracts made by the council could be repudiated and unenforceable and non-binding. Taylor recommended the council should immediately cease the supply and sale of quarry products, and in a discreet letter to Dean, without admitting the allegations, informing that it was not the council's intention to supply and sell metal. He warned them that if Dean did take legal action, the councillors were at risk of facing the cost of the court action and any damages out of their own pockets. Finally, he suggested that the council quietly lobby the Victorian minister in charge of a proposed bill to amend the Local Government Act to have changes made to permit them to legally supply and sell materials from the Axdale Quarry. The council followed Taylor's advice and sent the suggested letter to Dean. Several days later, the city's engineer informed the council that he and Taylor had visited the Minister for Public Works regarding an amendment to the Local Government Act, with an agreement that a bill would recommend an amendment to enable councils to sell metal to other shires and public bodies. Dean, however, was unimpressed and replied to the council's letter, demanding that he be compensated for the financial damage he had suffered through the council's illegal competition, which had put out of commission his stone crushing plant, private railway siding in Ingham, and his quarries for long periods of time. In reply, the council denied all his allegations, refused to compensate him, and stated that they would defend any legal proceedings Dean undertook. In his reply in January 1934, Dean was incredulous that the council were denying their contract to supply blue metal to Morongshire, an agreement which did take place in 1930 and was recorded in the council minutes. Dean may or may not also have been aware of the council's sale of screenings to Mr. Ackland in Swan Hill in May 1930, the tender they submitted to Deaconshire the same year. But he also accused the council of supplying blue metal to McGrath Brothers of Longleat for the Shire of Strathfieldsaye, for use on the Mackay Road at Axstone. Dean believed he would have won the Morong and Strathfieldsaye contracts were it not for the City Council's price-smashing activities. No record of any compensation paid to Dean or any legal action faced by the council has so far been uncovered in the City of Bendigo's archives. But given that much of this activity was taking place outside of the normal public domain, it might take some more detailed research to be certain. To be fair, the City of Bendigo was not the only council caught up in this illegal trade of road-making materials. In June 1934, a writ was issued by the Supreme Court against the President and councillors of the Shire of Frankston and Hastings following their illegal contract to supply the Chelsea Council with crushed rock for the Point Nepean Road. This is barely months after Dean's last letter to the City of Bendigo, and it seems the latter and the councillors were lucky that Dean had not followed through on his threats, even though it had forced them to mend their ways and cease their illegal trade. As for the attempt to have the Local Government Act amended to permit the trade of road making and other materials, the amended Act was passed in October 1934. The clause permitted councils to sell road-making materials obtained from council-owned quarries to the Water Supply Commission, Country Roads Board, State Electricity Commission and sewerage authorities, but only to other councils if both parties were beyond an 18-mile radius of the Melbourne GPO. The City Council decided in 1941 to sell the quarrying plant, the purchaser being the State Rivers and Water Supply Commission. Councillor Stredder voiced his disapproval of this decision and argued that if you do not lay the road foundations satisfactorily, you will never have a road. And the quarry was one of the finest assets the ratepayers have. Mr. Mickelson, who had approved the original purchase of the plant, said it was acquired to overcome difficulties in obtaining metal for road construction. Councillor Galvin added that the machinery would have become valueless if it was allowed to remain where it was, and Councillor Ham noted that the council was paying rent to the railway department and it was economical to sell the machinery. The committee of the whole council was given the task of deciding what the sale money should be spent on, and it appears that toilets at Rosalind Park and the Town Hall and an entrance building to the Upper Reserve Sports Ground was the result of their deliberations. So next time we drive on a bitumen or unsealed road, walk past the Bluestone Line Bendigo Creek, the Bluestone Gutter or Curb, the former Bendigo Post Office or Courthouse, or visit the Fernery in Rosalind Park or a local cemetery. Perhaps we should stop and take another look at the materials in front of us. Consider where they were from, how they got there, who was involved, and the huge effort made over many decades to prevent our roads becoming quagmires. Each site has a story to tell. Most of tonight's stories arose from a desire to secure the materials needed to make our lives more comfortable, and for some, to make a living out of extracting and processing. This sometimes resulted in some petty politics and hypocrisy, but that makes the stories even more human. It also demonstrates that council records are an endless source of materials for making the sometimes bumpy roads we travel when researching and reporting local history. The stories we have heard today also demonstrate that sometimes in-depth investigation in archives can reveal more on past events than what is written openly in public accounts. And thank you everyone for your interest tonight. I'm quite happy to take any questions. And just noting we hopefully have another event coming up in May, or just keep an eye on our website if you're interested in future events. So, yeah.
long in Bendigo because my friend's still finding it.
Okay, that's good.
And thank you.
Thank you.
I've got a question.
Yeah.
On the previous slide, that letter to the council,
Yep.
is that one upstairs?
Yes,
in,
it is.
Oh.
Yeah. The whole sequence of correspondence in a special file marked Axdale Quarries, where all this stuff that went on that wasn't issued at the council meetings is all tucked away in a manila folder.
Wow.
Yes.
Who tucked it away in that manila folder?
Well, interesting,
Yeah.
isn't it? Yes.
Mm.
Yeah, the legal advice, the letters from Dean, the copies of the letters back to Dean, all that stuff is tucked in that manila folder, which if you just go looking for the subject matter of quarries was there for finding.
Wow. That's interesting.
So you excluded the sandstone quarries intentionally. There were quite a lot around Bendigo, weren't they?
Yeah,
Sometimes they made quite extravagant claims about the quality of their stone.
I hope it's good stone. It's like puddings at home.
Yeah, and that's I suppose that point I made, that whole hype about, palatial city of bluestone. Bendigo's not known for that. Yes, a lot of house footings and stuff actually sandstone instead. So I suspect that was an article submitted to the Bendigo Advertiser by Nathaniel Ingham, but yeah, I'll but yes, it's the stone sources. I concentrated on bluestone, but I'm aware that there's all sorts of material out there, and it's huge number of years of research. I'm just trying to get that point of, let's start looking at stone and what resources are around, what they've got use for. It's very easy to ignore it, and
Guys, is the cathedral on the site of the old?
No, it's just above the boundary of them.
Oh, okay.
Yes, which is, if you have a look, it actually gets down a fair bit, so it's probably a sign of that excavation material.
I thought that was a steep hill.
Yeah. I went walking through the other side of Wattle Street. It's fairly flat, so if they were taking stone, it would have to have been on below with
Interesting.
It also shows that the Eddie wasn't afraid to stir up a bit by publishing all the letters of the people who were down in the council.
The continual complaints about roads and everything, that was just one little microcosm I was able to match up with some other council records to do with, and I could have spent years matching all of them up, but it's just a continual thing. It's still got it today. I mean, look what's happening on the Calder Highway with all the potholes at the moment, that sort of thing. Please just mend the Calder. Yeah.
There's a question on Zoom. When was the Quarry Hill State School built with bluestone?
It wasn't built with bluestone. From memory, it's got the windowsill. So it's the, I'm going to think now, it was not the current Quarry Hill School. It was the one that was built prior to that before it moved to the current site in Peel Street. Actually, that site on that street currently is actually a former quarry stone reserve that was declared in the 1870s, I think. And they sold that off as well. But it's the original Quarry Hill State School, not the current site. But I think you'll find it's probably got window sills or something like that.
Yeah, okay.
I'll read the story. The original one is a window
It's got that one, yeah.
So Harcourt Quarry and Mount Alexander Quarry were the same?
Well, Mount Alexander is mostly granite, so yes, there's quite a number of old quarry sites on Mount Alexander, but they're it's called Harcourt, that's the nearest town.
Yeah.
Thanks, sir.
Thank you very much.
Yeah.